You belong in a nursing home, not a palace. That is what my daughter-in-law said to me, smiling, standing in the kitchen of the house I built with my own 2 hands over 34 years. And about 10 seconds before that, my son, my only child, had told me, "This house is not really yours anymore, Mom. Maybe it is time you thought about somewhere smaller. Somewhere easier for you. Easier for me." Meaning easier for them. My son had already decided, without asking me one single question, that my 7-bedroom house on the lake was going to become his wife's parents' new home. And he told me this standing in my own kitchen, drinking coffee from a cup his father had given me 30 years ago, while his wife laughed about putting me somewhere with nurses and bingo nights. I was 67 years old, and I want you to know exactly what I did next because it matters more than anything else in this story. Smiled. He nodded. I said, "Of course, whatever you think is best." And I picked up my sweater and I walked out to my car and I drove away, and I did not raise my voice, not once. They thought they had won that day. I found that out later, because my daughter-in-law called her mother from my driveway before I had even reached the end of the road. 9 days after that, her parents arrived with 2 moving trucks and a rental van full of furniture. And what was waiting for them behind my front door made my daughter-in-law drop a box of dishes right there on the porch. I heard the plates break from where I was sitting. But I am getting ahead of myself. And none of this will make sense to you unless I tell it from the beginning. Because you need to understand how a woman almost loses the only home she has left in this world. And what was waiting on the other side of that door when they finally opened it. And I promise you it is not what you are expecting, and it has nothing to do with money. So stay with me until the end. And if you have ever been treated like a burden by someone who was already spending a future you had not given them yet, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button before we go any further. Because this is a story about a woman who was told she belonged in a nursing home instead of a palace, and about exactly what she did with her palace once she understood the truth. And I promise you the part where those plates hit the porch is worth every minute of waiting. Let me start at the beginning. My name is Susan Whitfield. I am 68 years old now. Everything I am about to tell you happened last year when I was 67. I want to start with how I got that house because the whole story hangs on it. I did not marry into money. I did not inherit a single dollar from anybody. My father worked in a factory that made auto parts, and my mother cleaned other people's houses 3 days a week to help make ends meet. Nobody in my family had ever owned anything worth more than a used car and a small plot of land. I met my husband Walter when I was 22, working as a receptionist at a small insurance office in Ohio. He was a quiet man who fixed things for a living, first as an electrician, and later he started his own small contracting company doing electrical work for other builders. We did not have much in those early years. I remember counting coins on the kitchen table to make sure we had enough for groceries and the light bill in the same week. Walter worked long hours. I raised our son mostly on my own during the week, and on weekends Walter would come home tired and quiet, and I would have dinner ready, and we would sit together and not say very much, because there was nothing left in either of us to say after a week like that. I am telling you this because I want you to understand something important. I was not always the woman standing in a 7-bedroom house on a lake. I was a woman who once wore the same winter coat for 6 years because a new one was not in the budget. Walter's company grew slowly over the years. By the time he was in his 40s, he was doing electrical work for large developments, entire neighborhoods at a time. It took nearly 25 years, but by the time Walter turned 60, his company was doing very well. We were not famous. Nobody outside our small industry had ever heard our name. But the business supported us comfortably, and when Walter finally sold it, we had more money than either of us had ever imagined having when we were young and counting coins on that kitchen table. We built the house on the lake 3 years after he sold the company. It was Walter's idea, actually, not mine. He said I had spent 40 years living in houses other people had already lived in, and he wanted to build me something that had never belonged to anybody else first. So we built it together, choosing every window and every stone on the outside, and we moved in when I was 62 years old. I loved that house more than any object has ever deserved to be loved. Not because it was large, though it was large, 7 bedrooms and a porch that wrapped around the back looking out over the water. I loved it because Walter and I built it after 40 years of hard work, and because I thought we would grow old together inside it, sitting on that back porch every evening watching the sun go down over the lake. We got 4 years in that house together. Just 4 years. Walter passed away from a heart problem nobody had seen coming, sitting in his chair in the living room on an ordinary Tuesday evening while I was in the kitchen finishing dinner. I found him when I brought his plate in. He looked like he was sleeping. I do not need to describe to you what those first months alone in that big house felt like. If you have lost someone you built a life with, you already know. If you have not, I hope you never learn it the hard way. I will tell you the one good thing I still hold on to from our last year together, and then I will move forward with the rest of this story, because dwelling on it for too long does neither of us any good. In the spring before he passed, Walter and I started a small habit. Every morning, no matter what, we carried our coffee out to the back porch and sat together for 20 minutes before either of us did anything else that day. No phones, no talking about work or bills or our son. Just the water and the birds and each other. We did that every single morning for almost a year. On one of those mornings, near the end, Walter turned to me and said, "Susan, I think this porch might be the smartest thing I ever built." And I laughed and asked him why, and he said, "Because it is the only place in this whole house where nobody needs anything from either of us." I think about that sentence more than almost anything else he ever said to me. That is the entire reason this story ends the way it ends. Everything I did later I did because of those mornings on the porch and what they taught me about what a home is actually supposed to be for. That was 3 years before everything I am about to tell you happened. Now let me tell you about my son. Stephen is 41 years old. He is my only child and I love him, and I need to say that clearly right at the beginning of this part of the story, because of everything I am about to tell you next. Stephen never had to struggle for anything, not really. By the time he was a teenager, Walter's business was already doing well, and I am not going to pretend that did not shape him. We paid for his college without him taking out a single loan. We paid for his wedding. We helped him with the down payment on his first house. When his first small business failed after about 2 years, taking almost $180,000 of our money with it, we did not say much about it because that is what we had always done. We wrote the check and moved on. I am not telling you this to make excuses for what happened later. I am telling you because I have had a long time to think about it, and I believe I played a part in shaping the man my son became. Every time life tried to teach Stephen a hard lesson, his father and I stepped in front of it and softened the blow. We thought we were being loving parents. What we were actually doing was raising a man who never had to find out what he was capable of on his own. Stephen married a woman named Denise about 7 years before all of this happened. She was 34 at the time, ambitious, sharp, and I want to be fair to her here because I have heard plenty of women online tell stories about terrible daughters-in-law, and I have always assumed there are two sides to every one of those stories. Denise came from a family that did not have very much growing up, and I understood wanting more than what you were given because I had wanted that too once, a long time ago. What I could never quite get past with Denise was the way she calculated everything. Every visit, every phone call, every holiday dinner seemed to circle back eventually to something she needed, something she wanted, something that would be so much easier if only I would help. After Walter passed, that calculating got faster and more constant because after Walter passed, I made a mistake that set the rest of this whole story in motion. I was 65 years old, freshly widowed, living alone in a 7-bedroom house with rooms I never even walked into anymore. I want to be honest with you. I was drowning in that house. I would wander through it at 2 in the morning because I could not sleep. I ate standing up at the kitchen counter most nights because sitting at that big empty table by myself was more than I could bear. Stephen noticed, and one afternoon he said, "Mom, why do you not let us move in with you for a little while? Just until you are back on your feet. You should not be rattling around this big house all alone." And I said yes. I want you to hear that part clearly because I think there are people watching this who have said yes to something very similar, and I do not want you to think I believe we were foolish for it. I think we were lonely, and being lonely makes a person generous in ways that people who are doing math in their heads can take advantage of. So Stephen, Denise, and their 2 children moved in. And for the first 6 months or so, it really was good. There was noise in the house again. There were small shoes by the front door and cartoons playing in the living room and someone else's coffee cup left in my sink. I liked it. I liked it more than I probably should admit. And then, so slowly that I cannot point to the exact day it started, things began to shift. The first thing was my sewing room. I had a small room upstairs where I did my quilting, something I had done since before Stephen was even born. Denise wanted to turn it into a playroom for the children, and I said fine, of course the children need a place to play. My sewing machine and my fabric bins went into a closet in the guest wing. Then it was the furniture. Walter and I had picked out every piece in that house together. And slowly, piece by piece, things started disappearing into storage and being replaced with things Denise liked better. I did not say anything. It is only furniture, I told myself. She is alive and raising my grandchildren under my roof, and Walter is gone, and none of it matters as much as I want it to matter. There was one afternoon, I understand now, looking back, that I completely misread at the time. I walked into my own kitchen and Denise had a woman there with fabric samples spread across my counter, some kind of decorator she had hired. I said something friendly, just making conversation, and the decorator turned to me and said, "Oh, are you the mother-in-law? It is so sweet that they let you stay here with them." Let me stay here with them. In my own house. And Denise did not correct her. She just let that sentence sit in the air between us. And then she said, "Susan, we are almost finished in here. Would you mind giving us a little privacy?" Would I mind? In my own kitchen? And I said, of course not. And I took my coffee out to the porch like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. That is how it happens, if you have never lived through something like this yourself. It is never one big moment where something gets taken from you. It is 40 small moments, and every single time saying something out loud would make you the difficult one, the ungrateful one, so you swallow it instead. And then one day you look up, and you realize you are living in the back corner of your own life. I remember another moment, smaller still, that I think about often. It was a Sunday morning, and I had gone down early to make pancakes for my grandchildren, the way I always used to when they were smaller, and it was still just the three of us in that kitchen most mornings. I had the batter mixed and the griddle warming when Denise came in and told me very sweetly that the children were on a new eating plan now, less sugar, less flour, and that maybe I should check with her first before feeding them anything from now on. I said of course, and I poured the batter down the drain. And I stood there at my own sink rinsing out my own mixing bowl while my grandchildren ate something out of a box in the other room. It was such a small thing. It was pancakes. But I remember standing there thinking, when did I start needing permission to feed my own grandchildren breakfast in my own kitchen? I did not have an answer for myself that morning, and I am not sure I fully have one even now. There was a particular Thanksgiving about a year before the night in the hallway that I think back on more than almost any other single day from that entire stretch of time. I had hosted Thanksgiving in that house every year since we built it, and I had always done the cooking myself, every dish the way Walter liked it. That year, Denise announced at breakfast that she and her mother would be handling the meal, that I should relax and enjoy being a guest at my own table for once. I sat in the living room most of that afternoon while pots clattered in my kitchen and voices I did not recognize discussed seasoning amounts I had never used in my life. When we finally sat down to eat, someone had moved my chair, the one at the head of the table where I had sat for 30 years, and put me instead at a smaller seat near the corner, so that Ron and Carol, who were visiting that year for the first time, could sit in what they called the good seats near the window. Nobody meant any harm by it, I do not think. That is almost the hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through something like this. Nobody in that room woke up that morning planning to hurt me. It simply did not occur to anyone that where I sat at my own table might matter to me, because somewhere along the way, I had stopped being someone whose feelings needed to be considered before decisions were made. I ate my turkey in the corner seat and complimented Carol's stuffing, and I meant it, it truly was very good stuffing, and I went to bed that night and cried for the first time in months, quietly so nobody in the house would hear me. After that, it was the guest suite over the garage. Stephen and Denise came to me together, the way they always did when something big was about to happen, and they explained that with the children getting older and needing more space, it might make more sense for me to move into the guest suite. More privacy for me, they said. Quieter. Better for everybody. The guest suite is lovely. It is nicer than any place I lived until I was well into my 40s. That is not the point. The point is that I moved out of the main part of the house Walter and I built together, and into a suite over the garage at 66 years old, and I told myself the whole time that it had been my idea. And once I was out there, I stopped being asked about anything at all. Contractors would show up and I would walk over and ask what was happening, and I would be told very sweetly that it was already being taken care of. Stephen started calling it our place, first in private, then in front of guests, and eventually, without even catching himself, right to my own face. And here is the detail I need you to hold on to because it is the backbone of everything that happens later in this story. That house was mine. Entirely, completely, solely mine. There was never a single moment where it belonged to anyone else. My name, and only my name, was on that deed, paid for in full with money from the sale of my husband's company. No mortgage. No partnership. No trust naming anyone else. Nothing. I had never signed a single document giving my son any ownership of that property. Not one page, not one signature. He had simply started behaving as though it were his, and because nobody corrected him for almost 2 years, he stopped even thinking of it as a question worth asking. Now let me tell you about the night I overheard them because that is the night everything changed for me. It was a Wednesday evening in the fall. I had walked over to the main house to get a book I had left in what used to be my reading nook, and I came in through the side door, the way I always did, quietly, without announcing myself. And I heard voices coming from the dining room. Stephen and Denise, with Denise's parents on speakerphone. I stopped in the dark hallway, and I listened to my son and my daughter-in-law plan the rest of my life. Denise's parents, Ron and Carol, were selling their small house 2 states away, and the plan, already well underway from the sound of it, was for Ron and Carol to move into the main part of my house, into the good rooms, into what used to be my bedroom, the one Walter and I had shared. And I heard Carol's voice through the speaker asking, "And what about Susan, what happens to her?" And I heard Denise say, "Oh, she is happy in the guest suite, honestly. And there are some really lovely senior communities not far from here, places with activities and other people her own age. She would probably be happier somewhere like that long term anyway." And I heard my son, my own son, say, "Yeah, probably within the next year or two. Probably a year or two." I stood in that dark hallway at 67 years old, and I did not make a single sound. I stood there and listened to my son and his wife discuss which facility they would eventually place me in, inside the house I had built with the money my husband and I earned together over 40 years of hard work. And I want to tell you exactly what I felt in that moment because it surprised me. It was not anger. It was clarity. It was the clearest my mind had been in 3 years. It felt like someone had finally switched on a light in a room I had been stumbling around in the dark for a very long time. Because in that moment, standing in that hallway, I finally let myself understand something I had been refusing to face since Walter died. My son was not going to change. I had been waiting for him to change, quietly, patiently, for 3 years, and probably for many years before that if I am being completely honest with myself. I had been telling myself he was still the good boy underneath, that he would grow into the man I always believed he could be. And standing in that hallway, I finally accepted that the man in that dining room was exactly who he had become, and that his father and I had built him that way, one soft landing at a time. Got my book. I walked back to the guest suite. I did not say a word to anyone that night. And the next morning I called a lawyer. Now let me tell you about Margaret Ellis because she is the reason this story ends the way it does. Margaret is a woman in her early 60s who specializes in elder law and estate matters. A friend of mine from my quilting group recommended her, someone with absolutely no connection to my son or his wife whatsoever. I want to pause here and tell you something important. If you are ever in a situation anything like mine, do not use the family lawyer, the one everybody already knows and trusts. Find someone completely outside of your family circle. I sat in Margaret's office and told her everything, start to finish. And when I finished talking, she asked me a question nobody had asked me in 3 years. She said, "Susan, what do you actually want?" And I sat there and I could not answer her right away because I had spent 3 years being managed by 2 people who always had a plan. And the strange and terrible thing about being managed for that long is that you slowly stop knowing how to want anything for yourself. Margaret let the silence sit there for a good while. Then she said, "All right, let me ask it differently. If that house disappeared tomorrow, completely gone, what would you actually miss about it?" And I said, "Nothing." I heard myself say it, and I realized, sitting right there in that office chair, that it was true. There was nothing left in that house that I truly wanted anymore. My husband was not in it. Even our furniture was not really in it anymore, most of it sitting in a storage unit somewhere across town. It had become 11,000 square feet of somebody else's idea of a life, and I had not slept a peaceful night under that roof in almost 2 years. And Margaret said, then let us talk about what that house could actually do instead. I want to walk you carefully through what I did next because this is the part people get wrong when they hear this story secondhand. And because what I actually did was completely legal, completely quiet, and that is exactly why it worked so well. Over the following 9 weeks, I made a charitable donation of that property. That is the entire secret. There was no elaborate trap. There was no scheme designed to humiliate anyone. A woman who owns a piece of real estate outright, with her name and only her name on the deed, is allowed to give that property away if she chooses to. So I gave mine away. I gave it to a foundation that supports elderly women who have lost their homes or their independence due to family situations very much like mine, women who have money on paper sometimes, but nobody in the world who actually wants them around anymore, and women who have nowhere safe left to go. There is a quiet crisis happening all across this country involving older women exactly like that. And there is a second one, involving families who are caring for aging parents and slowly being crushed under the weight of it financially and emotionally, because affordable respite care barely exists anywhere. The foundation I chose works directly inside that gap. What they desperately needed and could never afford in that entire county was a large residential property that could serve as a transitional home for women in exactly that situation. I went and saw the small building they were currently working out of before I made my final decision. Margaret drove me there herself. It was a converted duplex near a busy road with only 6 beds and a waiting list well over 80 names long. The director apologized twice for the peeling paint on the ceiling. And I stood in that narrow hallway and thought about 7 empty bedrooms sitting on a quiet lake, while a woman on the phone behind me told somebody there would be nothing available until at least the spring. That was the whole decision right there. Took me about 10 seconds, and I have never once looked back on it since. So I gave them a house on a lake, 7 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a view of the water Walter and I used to sit and watch every single morning of our lives together. I put exactly one condition on that gift. It had to carry my husband's name. The Walter Whitfield house. He built that house for me with his own 2 hands after 40 years of hard work, and he only got 4 years inside it before he was gone. Now his name is going to be on the front of that building for the next 50 years, and there are going to be women sitting on that same back porch, watching the same water, no longer alone at the end of their lives. That is the closest thing to fairness I could put together out of everything that happened, and I will take it gladly. Those 9 weeks were some of the strangest of my entire life, and I want to describe them honestly because people probably imagine I felt some kind of quiet joy through all of it, and I really did not. I sat through dinner with my son and his wife more times than I can count during those weeks. I read bedtime stories to my grandchildren in a living room that had already stopped legally belonging to any of us, while an architect I had already hired was reviewing blueprints in a parking lot across town. I said good morning to my own son in a driveway that had stopped being mine 6 days earlier. And every single night I walked back out to the guest suite over the garage, and I did not feel clever or triumphant. I felt like a woman watching a wave roll in slowly from far out on the water, already knowing exactly where and when it would break, and choosing not to shout a warning. I slept better during those 9 weeks than I had in the past 3 years combined. Make of that whatever you like. I stopped trying to make sense of it a long time ago myself. The paperwork closed near the end of that 9th week, and I did not say a single word about it to anyone in my family. Now I need to tell you about the certified letter because this is the detail that turned the entire situation into what it eventually became. Margaret was extremely firm with me about one thing. She said, "We are not going to ambush anybody in this family. We are going to give proper written notice, well in advance, with a clear date, delivered in a way we can absolutely prove later if we ever need to. Not because the law requires us to be kind about it, but because I will not have anyone in your family able to say afterward that you were sneaking around behind their backs. Everything we do from this point forward, we do out in the open and on the record." So a certified letter went out to my son at that address. It stated plainly that ownership of the property had transferred to the foundation as of the closing date. It stated that the foundation was granting him and his household a courtesy period to remain in the home before it needed to be vacated, and it gave a specific date, clearly written, for when that period would end. It was polite. It was completely clear. He signed for it himself and we have that signature on file. And here is exactly what my son did with that letter. Nothing at all. He told no one. He did not tell his wife. He did not tell her parents, who were at that very moment already under contract to sell their own house across the state line. He read a certified letter telling him plainly that the home now belonged to a charitable foundation, and he decided it was some kind of overreaction on my part, that his mother was simply upset and emotional, and that he would drive over one afternoon and have a calm talk with me, and everything would smooth itself out the way it always had his entire life. He never came to talk to me. Not once. I want to say that again because it might be the saddest sentence in this entire story. My own son received a letter telling him he was about to lose a house worth well over $2 million, and he did not think it was worth even a 15-minute conversation with his own mother. So instead he simply waited. And while he waited, his in-laws finished selling their house. Now let me finally tell you about the afternoon in the kitchen because that is where I started this whole story. It was the second week of that following month, and by then the foundation was already moving quickly, surveyors, contractors, a project coordinator walking the grounds with a clipboard every few days. I happened to be at the main house that particular afternoon because I was meeting with the project manager about a small detail regarding the porch. Stephen came into the kitchen and asked me who all these people wandering around the property were, and I told him honestly that they were with the foundation. And he said, and I could see in his face that he had decided this was finally the moment to put an end to whatever he assumed I was doing. He said, "Mom, we need to be honest with each other right now. This has gone on long enough. Ron and Carol close on their new house in 2 weeks. They are moving in here. This is really their place now, and honestly at this point it might just be time you thought about somewhere smaller and easier." And Denise was standing near the stairs. She had come out just to watch. And she laughed. Not a loud laugh, just a light little one, the kind of laugh you use when you already believe the outcome was never really in doubt. And she said, "Susan, come on now, you belong in a nursing home, not a palace." I looked at the two of them standing there in my kitchen. And I want to be completely honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it is probably not what you would expect. I did not feel triumphant at all. I already knew exactly what was coming, and I did not enjoy that knowledge one bit. What I actually felt was tired and enormously sad, and something close to pity because I was the only person standing in that kitchen who understood what was about to happen to all four of us in the very near future. And I understood right there in that moment that I still had the power to stop it. I could have opened my mouth right then and said the handful of sentences that would have prevented the entire thing from unfolding the way it eventually did. And I did not say them. I have thought about that choice more than any other choice I have made in my entire life. And I will tell you honestly where I have landed on it. I did not stay quiet to punish either of them. I stayed quiet because I had finally, at 67 years old, stopped trying to manage my son's life for him from behind the scenes. He received a certified letter. He made a choice about what to do with it. For the first time in 41 years, I let my son find out for himself exactly what happens when you decide not to take something seriously. That is either the most loving thing I have ever done for that boy or the coldest thing I have ever done to him, and some days I honestly still do not know which one it was. So I smiled. He nodded. I said, "Of course, whatever you think is best." I picked up my sweater and I walked out to my car and I drove away. 9 days later, 2 moving trucks and a rental van came up that driveway. Now I want to explain why I happened to be there that day because this is the one part of the whole story I will admit was deliberate, and I have made my peace with it. I was there because the foundation had asked me to be. That was the exact day the new nameplate was being installed, and the project team was doing their formal final walkthrough before opening, and they had invited me for the small ceremony around hanging that plate. It had been scheduled on the calendar for weeks in advance. Did I know that Ron and Carol were closing on their new place around that same time? Yes, I did. Did I know it would happen to fall on the exact same morning? No, I honestly did not, and that is the truth. But I will not sit here and tell you I was sorry when those trucks came rolling up that drive. I am simply not that good of a woman, and I have stopped pretending otherwise. Here is exactly what was inside that house that morning. 5 people from the foundation, including their executive director. An architect and a contractor with drawings spread out across my old dining room table. A project coordinator wearing a hard hat. My attorney Margaret Ellis in a sharp gray suit, holding a folder, because Margaret never misses a single detail. and a local sheriff's deputy, standing quietly near the front hall. Not because anyone expected trouble. Margaret had simply made a routine request for a civil standby, which is a perfectly ordinary thing to arrange whenever a property transfer involves people who might not have fully absorbed the news yet. And hanging in the front entryway, put up just 2 hours earlier, a small brushed silver plate that read, "The Walter Whitfield House, a home for women beginning again." I was sitting quietly in a chair near the front window in that entryway, still wearing my sweater, because I had just come in from the porch. The front door was standing wide open because the contractors were carrying equipment in and out. So Ron and Carol did not even need to knock. They simply walked straight in. Carol first, then Ron behind her, then Denise following with a mug of coffee in one hand and a set of keys in the other. They walked into that entryway mid-conversation, the easy kind of conversation you have when you believe you are arriving somewhere that already belongs to you. And then they stopped walking entirely. I want to describe this carefully because it happened in stages, and altogether it probably took no more than 10 seconds. First, they noticed the people. Strangers, a hard hat, drawings spread across the table, a uniformed deputy standing near the dining room doorway. And Carol said, "Oh, sorry, are we interrupting something?" the way you speak when you think you have wandered into the wrong event entirely. Then Denise saw me, sitting quietly in the chair by the window. And I watched something complicated move across her face, because I was supposedly the woman who had already accepted a smaller, easier place somewhere else. And there I was instead, sitting calmly in that chair, as though I had been waiting there the entire 9 days, which in a very real sense I had. Then she saw the plate hanging on the wall. I was watching her eyes when she read it. I saw them move across the words, then move back to the beginning and read it again, the way a person does when the words simply refuse to arrange themselves properly the first time through. The Walter Whitfield House. Walter. My husband. Her husband's own father. On a plate mounted in the very entryway her parents were about to move furniture into within the next 3 hours. And I need to be precise about the order in which everything hit her because that order is what caused all the real damage. She did not look at that plate and simply think we have been cheated out of something. That thought alone would have been survivable for her. What she actually understood, standing there in that doorway with her parents right behind her and their old house already sold and gone, was that this entire situation had been finished and settled and mounted permanently on a wall for a very long time already. And that finishing had clearly taken months to arrange. That kind of plate does not get made overnight. It requires planning, ordering, waiting. And if it had taken months, then somebody had known about all of this for months. I watched her follow that entire chain of thought all the way to its end while she was still standing on the front mat. And that is the exact moment she dropped the coffee mug she was holding. It did not just tip over quietly. It shattered against the tile, loudly, and the sound seemed to hang in that entryway for far longer than it should have. Nobody moved to clean it up right away. The broken pieces just sat there on the floor while everyone stood frozen for what felt like a very long stretch of silence. And Ron, who I have never had one unkind word to say about and still do not, looked at his daughter and asked, "Denise, what exactly is going on here?" And that is the precise moment my son walked through the front door behind all 3 of them. I will never forget the look on his face in that instant, because Stephen understood everything immediately. He did not need to read the plate. He had been carrying that certified letter around for 5 weeks already. I watched my own son walk into a room and realize, all at once, that the very thing he had chosen to ignore had happened exactly on schedule, precisely as it had been written down in black and white, and that his wife and her parents were now standing directly in the middle of it. Margaret Ellis stepped forward calmly and introduced herself, explaining that she represented me, that ownership of the property had transferred to the foundation back in the summer, that written notice had been delivered and signed for on a specific documented date, and that she had copies of every relevant paper with her if anyone wished to review them. She had, of course, brought copies. Margaret never arrives anywhere without exactly what she needs. Denise turned to face her husband and said, "Signed for? What on earth is she talking about, signed for?" And Stephen did not answer her at all. And that silence answered every question she had far more clearly than any words ever could have. I stood up out of my chair then, walked over and picked up the broken pieces of the mug from the floor, because Denise was shaking too hard to do it herself, and it seemed like the decent thing to do. And I said the only sentence I spoke to any of them that entire morning. I said, "There is a very nice retirement community about 20 minutes from here that is currently accepting new residents. Your mother is more than welcome to look into it. We happen to keep a waiting list." Then I picked up my sweater from the chair, and I walked past the trucks parked outside, and I drove home to the guest suite that, for a few more weeks at least, was still mine to return to. Now let me tell you the honest rest of it, because stories like this always want to stop right at the satisfying part, and I do not think that would be fair to you. Ron and Carol had already closed on their new house across the state line by that point. That part was completely real, and it was genuinely unfortunate, and I have never once felt good about that particular consequence. Those are two people in their 70s who sold the home they had lived in for decades because their daughter and son-in-law told them a beautiful house on a lake was waiting for them, and it was gone before they ever got there, because my son sat quietly on a letter for 5 entire weeks. They stayed in a small rental apartment for nearly 4 months while they figured out their next steps. It was Carol, of all people, who called me one Sunday afternoon about 6 weeks after everything happened. She was not angry at all, and I have thought about that phone call more times than I can count. She said, "Susan, I want you to know I do not blame you for any of this. I would have done exactly the same thing in your position. I just wish somebody had told us the truth sooner." And I told her that was the most honest sentence anybody had said to me through this entire situation, and I meant every word of it. We are friendly with each other now, in a strange and unexpected way. She sends me a card every year around the holidays. Stephen and Denise's marriage did not survive what happened. They separated about 4 months later, and the divorce was finalized this past spring. I want to be very careful here because I know exactly how this sounds, and I am not going to try to soften it or dress it up for you. That separation was not entirely my doing, and it was also not entirely unrelated to what I did either, and I have stopped pretending those two things can be kept completely separate from each other. What actually ended that marriage was not the house itself. It was the fact that Denise found out, standing in front of her own parents, that her husband had known about all of it for 5 full weeks and had said absolutely nothing to her. Everything that came after that discovery was simply the paperwork catching up to a decision that had already been made in that entryway. Stephen and I did not speak to each other for almost 6 months after that morning. Then, near the end of that 6th month, he called me, and we met for coffee at a small diner not far from where he was renting an apartment on his own. I want to tell you honestly that it was not any kind of warm reunion. It was hard and it was tense, and he was still very angry with me. He told me I had humiliated him in front of his in-laws, and I said, "Yes, that is fair, and I am genuinely sorry it happened in front of them specifically, but I would still do the exact same thing again if I had to." And then he said the sentence I still think about more than any other. He said, "You could have just told me directly." And I said, "Stephen, I sent you a certified letter." He sat with that for a long moment, and I watched him truly understand it, maybe for the first time in his entire life, that it had genuinely never once occurred to him to take his own mother seriously. That the letter had arrived, and he had quietly filed it away under things Mom will eventually calm down about. He is 41 years old, and that was the very first real consequence he had ever faced in his entire life that I did not step in and quietly pay away for him. We are something now that I do not have a perfect word for. Talk. It is careful and it is slow, but it is honest in a way our relationship never quite managed to be before. He is working now, an actual job with an actual employer, something in logistics, and he is not particularly good at it yet, and he does not enjoy it much, and I have not offered him a single dollar to make it easier, and I do not plan to. That is the most real parenting I believe I have ever done for that boy, and I finally started at 67 years old. My 2 grandchildren are 7 and 4 now, and Denise has been considerably more decent about arranging visits than I expected her to be, and I have told her so directly. Those 2 children are going to grow up actually knowing their grandmother, and that matters to me far more than that house ever did. The property took nearly a year to fully renovate for its new purpose, and it opened this past spring. It now houses 10 women at a time, along with 3 respite beds that turn over regularly for women who only need a short stay while their families figure out a longer-term plan. Go every Tuesday. I do not do anything particularly useful there. I am not a nurse, and I would honestly be more of a hazard than a help if I tried. Mostly what I do is sit out on that same back porch with whoever wants some company that afternoon, and I listen to women in their 70s and 80s tell me about their lives, which has turned out to be one of the finest ways I have ever found to spend an afternoon. There is a woman there named Dorothy, 86 years old, who used to travel the entire country selling textiles before she retired, and who has no living family left at all, not one single person. Every single Tuesday she asks me the exact same question when I sit down beside her, which is, "Susan, what is new with you this week?" And I tell her whatever small news I have. That is the entirety of our friendship, and it means more to me than almost anything else in my life right now. She sits in the same chair by the window every time. I have never told her about those mornings on the porch with Walter, and I never plan to. Some things you simply keep for yourself. There is also a woman named Beatrice, only 63, younger than most of the others there, who arrived about 4 months ago after her own son sold the house she had lived in for 30 years without ever telling her the closing date until the truck was already outside. She did not speak to anyone for almost 2 weeks after she moved in. She sat by herself at meals and stared out the window during the afternoon sitting hours, and Rosa would bring her tea and sit quietly beside her without asking anything at all. I remember the first time Beatrice actually spoke to me. It was a Tuesday and I sat down near her by the window the way I always do, and instead of asking me anything she simply said, "Out of nowhere I keep waiting to feel angry, and I do not feel angry, I just feel foolish, like I should have seen it coming." And I told her the truest thing I know, which is that seeing it coming has nothing to do with whether it happens anyway, and that feeling foolish is simply what it costs you to have loved someone as much as you did. She cried for a while after that, and I sat with her, and neither of us said very much else that afternoon, and I think that was exactly right. Beatrice has been doing better lately. Last week she asked Rosa if she could start helping in the small garden out back, and Rosa found her a pair of gloves within the hour. I think that garden is going to matter to Beatrice a great deal, the same way that back porch mattered to Walter me all those years ago. It is a strange thing, watching a stranger begin to heal in the exact same rooms where you once nearly lost yourself. I did not expect that part of this whole story, and it has become one of the parts one am most grateful for. Now I have to tell you about Rosa Delgado, because I have saved her for last on purpose. Rosa cleaned that house for 19 years. Going all the way back to our old place before we ever built on the lake. She was there through most of Walter's illness in his final months, sitting quietly with him on afternoons when I could not bear to be in the room myself, and I never properly thanked her for that, because there truly is no adequate way to thank someone for something like that. And when Stephen and Denise moved in, they cut her hours down almost immediately, and eventually let her go entirely through a text message, after 19 years of loyal work, with no severance and no real notice, because Denise wanted to switch to a cleaning service instead. That was actually the very first thing I did, even before contacting the foundation, before any of the rest of it. That was week 1, sitting in Margaret's office. I set up a monthly annuity for Rosa, a real and permanent one, funded for the rest of her life, along with coverage for her healthcare needs. It is, without question, the best money I have ever spent in my entire life, and it did not require taking anything away from anybody else to make it happen. She works at the house now, if you can believe that. The foundation hired her on as their residence coordinator entirely on their own, because I simply gave them her name and then stepped completely out of the way. She runs that entire building now. She knows every single corner of it. She is the one who shows new families around when they first arrive. She still calls me ma'am after all these years, and I have given up trying to get her to stop. Here is the thought I keep returning to, and then I will let you go for tonight. My daughter-in-law told me I belonged in a nursing home instead of a palace, and she meant it as the cruelest thing she could think of to say to me in that moment, that I was old and finished, that women like me belong tucked away somewhere out of sight while women like her get to enjoy the good rooms with a good view. And what I keep coming back to is this. She was not actually wrong about the building itself. She was only wrong about who that building was truly meant for. That house is full of older women every single day now. Women in their 70s and 80s, in the good rooms, with a view of the water, being cared for by people who genuinely chose to be there. It is, in the most literal sense possible, a nursing home inside a palace. She is the one who named it that first. I simply handled the paperwork. And here is the part one actually hope you carry with you if you take nothing else away from this story. I did not do any of this to get revenge on anybody. If revenge had been what I truly wanted, Margaret laid out several far more damaging options for me early on, and I turned every single one of them down. I did what I did because on that night I stood alone in that dark hallway. I finally understood what my real problem had actually been for 3 long years. It was never really that my son wanted my house. It was that I had stopped wanting anything at all for myself. I had 11 rooms of space and every reason in the world to be perfectly fine, and I could not have told you one single thing I actually wanted out of the rest of my own life. And a woman who does not want anything for herself becomes furniture. She gets rearranged around the room by whoever happens to be doing the decorating that season. The day I finally decided what that house was truly for, I stopped being furniture in my own life. That is the whole story. Everything else, the broken mug on the tile, the look on her face when she finally understood, that is simply what happened afterward, and honestly, it mattered a great deal less to me in the end than I ever expected it would. If you are being quietly managed by your own family right now, if you have noticed people discussing your future in front of you as though you are not even in the room, I want you to hear this from a woman who let it continue for 3 full years before she finally did something about it. It does not stop simply because you are patient. It stops the day you decide you want something specific for yourself, and you say it out loud to a lawyer who has never once met your children. So let me ask you something before you go, because I truly do read every single comment. Have you ever let someone move into your home or your life temporarily, only to slowly realize you had somehow become the guest inside your own story? How did that happen to you, and what did you eventually do about it? I would genuinely like to know, because I know I was not the only woman who did not see it clearly until she was already living in the back room of her own house. And this next question matters to me even more than the first one. Is there someone in your life like my Rosa? Someone who was never technically family, but who showed up for you anyway, year after year, and never once received the proper thank you they deserved? Tell me about them in the comments below. Say their name out loud, even if it is only in writing. Those are the people this entire story is actually about, when you get right down to it. If this story meant something to you tonight, please do me that one favor I asked for at the very beginning. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me. There is another story coming very soon, and I promise you it is a good one.